My name is Evelyn Hart, and I'm in my mid-30s. I live a quiet life now, one that looks ordinary from the outside. I work in finance, I keep my circle small, and I've learned how to be precise with my words. People often describe me as calm, reserved, and even unremarkable. Some assume that means I'm passive, others mistake it for weakness. I've learned not to correct them. For most of my life, I was seen as the almost version of who I should have been. Almost successful, almost impressive, almost worth bragging about. I was the daughter who didn't fail loudly enough to be disowned, but didn't succeed loudly enough to be celebrated. The one who did everything right on paper, yet somehow still managed to disappoint. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, cinematic way. There are no raised voices, no slammed doors, no moment where I finally snap. What happened instead was quieter, and far more unsettling for the people who thought they understood me. It begins with a $350,000 bill sent by my own mother, labeled, without irony, the cost of raising a failure. When I received it, I didn't cry. I didn't call her. I didn't even feel angry, not in the way people expect anger to look. What I felt was something slower, heavier, a realization that what she thought would humiliate me was actually a confession, not about me, but about her. And then something unexpected happened. My grandmother stepped in. What followed wasn't a public reckoning. It was a gradual uncovering of truths that had been buried under years of polite silence, family expectations, and carefully maintained narratives. Truths about money, about control, about who had really failed whom, and who had quietly been paying the price. This is a story about being underestimated so consistently that people stop watching you. About how silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes leverage. About emotional justice that doesn't announce itself, but arrives all the same. I'm telling this now not to shame anyone, and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because there are people listening who have been labeled before they were understood, who were told, directly or indirectly, that their worth had already been calculated and found lacking. If you stay with me, you won't hear a tale of dramatic triumph. You'll hear something more uncomfortable than that. The sound of a narrative collapsing under its own assumptions. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how often the quietest person in the room is the one everyone misunderstands the most? To my family, I was never a mystery. I was the conclusion they had reached early and never revisited. I was the quiet one, which in our house didn't mean thoughtful or observant. It meant forgettable. The child who didn't demand attention, so none was given. My older brother was loud, brilliant, difficult, therefore important. My younger sister was charming, emotional, and easy to root for. I was the space in between, the one who didn't cause problems and therefore wasn't discussed. When relatives asked my mother about her children, she spoke in bullet points, my brother's achievements, my sister's personality, and then, almost as an afterthought, my name, followed by a vague phrase like she's doing fine or she's responsible. Responsible was the word people used when they didn't know what else to say. At school, teachers liked me. I did my work, turned it in on time, and never tested boundaries. But liking isn't the same as noticing. I was rarely encouraged to aim higher because I never appeared to struggle. No one asks a quiet child if she's quietly drowning. At home, expectations were subtle but rigid. I was expected to help without being asked, to adapt without complaint, to succeed without needing resources. If something went wrong, it was assumed I would absorb the inconvenience. And I did, because I learned early that pushing back only made me seem ungrateful. My mother liked to frame her sacrifices as investments. She talked often about what she'd given up for us, especially for me. Piano lessons I didn't ask for. Summer programs chosen without my input. Schools, she insisted, were best, regardless of whether they fit me. Every decision was recorded somewhere in her mind as proof of her effort, and later, as ammunition. If I hesitated, I was told I didn't appreciate what I'd been given. If I succeeded, it was because of her guidance. If I fell short, it was because I hadn't lived up to my potential. There was no version of the story where I was simply human. What's important to understand is that none of this felt dramatic at the time. There was no single moment of cruelty I could point to and say, that's when it broke. It was quieter than that. more procedural, like a system that had decided my function and optimized around it. I became useful. I handled paperwork, I remembered dates, I smoothed over tensions. People rely on you quickly when you make their lives easier and ask for nothing in return. And reliance looks a lot like respect, until you realize it isn't. By my late 20s, I had a stable career, paid my own bills, and never asked my parents for money. From the outside, I looked independent. From the inside, I was still being measured against an invisible ledger I'd never agreed to keep. Family gatherings followed the same rhythm. My accomplishments were mentioned only if they could be compared to someone else's. Always softer, always smaller. I learnt to downplay myself before anyone else could. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I participated in my own erasure. I told myself it was maturity, that I didn't need validation, that staying quiet was a sign of strength. And maybe some of that was true. But it was also fear. The fear that if I spoke up and still wasn't heard, it would confirm what they already seemed to believe. So I stayed in the role they'd assigned me. The reliable daughter, the low-risk investment, the one who would never embarrass them, but also never outshine them. They thought they knew me completely. They thought my silence meant agreement. They thought my calm meant acceptance. They thought my lack of protest meant a lack of awareness. They were wrong. But at that time, I didn't correct them. Not because I couldn't, but because I hadn't yet decided whether it was worth it. The first time I remember feeling diminished, truly diminished, it didn't come wrapped in cruelty. There was no raised voice, no insult sharp enough to echo later. That's why it took me years to name it for what it was. It happened at a family dinner, one of those carefully staged evenings where everything looked warm from the outside. Candles on the table, my mother's best dishes, conversation engineered to sound effortless. I had just accepted my first full-time role after graduate school. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. I was proud of it in the quiet way I'd learned to be proud, by keeping it to myself until asked. When the topic of work came up, my uncle leaned toward me and said, "So, Evelyn, what are you doing these days?" I answered honestly. I explained the role, the firm, and what I was learning. I didn't embellish, I didn't minimize, just facts. My mother smiled politely, then cut in before anyone could respond. "Well," she said lightly, "it's not exactly what we imagined for. But it's a start." A start. The word landed softly, like a napkin placed over a stain. No one reacted. My uncle nodded. Someone changed the subject. The conversation moved on, as if nothing had happened. But something had. In that single sentence, my effort was reframed as a compromise. My achievement is recast as a placeholder. And because it was done so gently, so reasonably, it gave everyone else permission to accept it without question. I smiled. Of course I did. Smiling had become reflex. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head, trying to decide whether I was being too sensitive. That was my instinct, to audit my own feelings before anyone else had the chance to dismiss them. She didn't mean it that way, I told myself. She's just being honest. She wants the best for me. That's how small cuts survive. They're easy to excuse. They don't bleed enough to demand attention. Over the next few months, similar moments appeared. Comments made in passing, jokes that framed me as the cautious one, the safe one, the one who didn't aim too high. Each time, they were delivered with a smile, in a tone that suggested concern rather than criticism. And each time, everyone else missed it, or pretended to. At another gathering, a family friend asked my mother if I'd ever considered switching careers. "She doesn't really have the temperament for high-pressure environments," my mother replied, glancing at me as if seeking agreement. "She prefers stability." I hadn't said that, but I nodded anyway. What would have happened if I'd corrected her? Probably nothing, and that was the problem, because challenging her wouldn't have led to an apology or a conversation. It would have led to a sigh, a look, a reminder of how much she'd done for me. The cost-benefit analysis never favored speaking up, so I stored the moment away. That became my habit, quietly cataloguing discrepancies between who I was and who I was being described as. I didn't confront, I documented. Not on paper, not yet, but in memory. The first small cut didn't hurt because it was deep. It hurt because it revealed something structural, a pattern, a narrative that didn't require my participation to continue. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. I began to realize that my presence in conversations wasn't to be understood. It was to be summarized, reduced to a version that made other people comfortable, a version that justified their expectations and absolved them of curiosity. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I was learning how easily truth could be edited in real time, learning how authority often sounds like certainty, learning how quickly silence gets mistaken for consent. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision so small it didn't feel like one at all. I stopped explaining myself, not out of resentment, not as a strategy, yet, but because I sensed even then that every explanation I offered was being used to reinforce a story I hadn't written. And if that was the case, I wanted to know exactly how that story ended. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. More often, it settles in quietly, like dust. You don't notice it accumulating until one day you realize the surface beneath has disappeared. After that first dinner, nothing outwardly changed. No arguments, no dramatic shifts. Life continued exactly as it had before, which made it easier to convince myself that what I'd felt wasn't real, or at least not important enough to address. That's how normalization begins. My mother's comments became more frequent, but also more refined. She learned how to phrase them as concern, how to disguise judgment as realism. If I mentioned a long-term goal, she would nod thoughtfully and say, "Let's be practical." If I spoke about an opportunity, she would ask if it was gibbonais, always stability, as if ambition were a liability I needed protection from. At first, I tried to meet her where she was. I framed my plans in conservative language. I emphasized security, longevity, and responsibility. I thought if I spoke her dialect fluently enough, she would finally hear me. She didn't, because the issue was never the content of what I said. It was the role I occupied while saying it. I was the daughter who needed managing, the one whose decisions were provisional until validated by someone else. And once a family assigns you a role, they defend it with surprising ferocity, especially if it allows them to feel superior. Other relatives followed her lead. It was subtle, almost collaborative. My brother's risks were described as bold. My caution was described as limited. My sister's mistakes were framed as growing pains. Mine were framed as evidence. If I worked late, I was overcompensating. If I rested, I was unmotivated. If I stayed quiet, I was passive. There was no winning because the conclusion had already been reached. The worst part wasn't the comments themselves, it was how quickly I learned to anticipate them. I'd rehearse responses in my head, then discard them before speaking. I'd soften statements preemptively, as if bracing for impact. And when I did feel hurt, I told myself it was my responsibility to regulate it. That emotional self-control was a virtue, that being affected meant being weak. So I normalized it. I normalized being interrupted. I normalized being summarized incorrectly. I normalized having my experiences reframed through someone else's lens. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, that families were complicated, that no one was intentionally unkind. But intent doesn't erase impact. What no one noticed, because I didn't let them, was how carefully I was paying attention. I listened not just to what was said, but to who was believed, whose version of events became official, whose emotions were treated as facts. I began to see how power functioned in our family. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand obedience, it simply assumed authority and waited for others to comply. And I complied on the surface. Inside, something was hardening, not into anger, but into clarity. I stopped trying to correct misunderstandings in real time. I let people mislabel me. I let them underestimate my intelligence, my awareness, my patience. Not because it didn't bother me, but because I started to understand the advantage of being unseen. People are careless around those they don't consider a threat. They speak freely, they make assumptions out loud, they leave things unattended. And the more normalized the disrespect became, the more information it yielded. Family conversations revealed financial habits. Old grievances slipped out as jokes. My mother, especially, had a habit of narrating her sacrifices in increasing detail. Numbers, dates, amounts. She liked precision when it supported her narrative. I remembered all of it. Still, I said nothing. From the outside, I looked unchanged. Still calm, still accommodating, still the daughter who didn't push back. But internally, the rationalizations I'd used to survive were expiring. I could no longer pretend I was imagining the pattern. I could no longer mistake endurance for harmony. Normalizing disrespect had kept the peace, but it had also clarified the cost. And once you know the cost, the question becomes unavoidable. How long are you willing to keep paying it? Roles are rarely announced. They emerge quietly, through repetition, until one day you realize you're performing without having agreed to the part. In my family, my role was utility. I was the one who could be relied on without being consulted. The one who would adjust her schedule, absorb inconvenience, smooth over discomfort. If someone needed help with paperwork, logistics, or planning, my name surfaced automatically. Not because I was asked, but because it was assumed. And I fulfilled that role well, too well. Reliability became my defining trait. Not intelligence, not discernment, not ambition, just usefulness. When my mother spoke about me to others, it was always in terms of function. I was good with details, very organized, not emotional. Compliments that sounded positive but placed me firmly in the background. Support staff in my own life. I began to understand that my value, as they saw it, was conditional. I mattered as long as I made things easier, as long as I didn't disrupt the emotional economy of the family. The moment I stopped being useful or started asserting boundaries, I sensed the discomfort it caused. Not anger exactly, more like confusion, as if a familiar appliance had started malfunctioning. One afternoon, my mother asked me to help sort through some old documents she'd kept in storage. Bills, receipts, bank statements. She said she was just overwhelmed and needed a second pair of eyes. I agreed without hesitation. That was still my reflex. As we worked, she narrated. She always did. Stories about how hard it had been raising us, how much she'd sacrificed, how ungrateful children could be without realizing it. She pointed to numbers as if they were evidence in a trial. Do you know how much this costs? Do you remember how many years I worked overtime? People don't understand what mothers give up. I listened, I nodded, I sorted. At one point, she laughed lightly and said, "You've always been good at this, handling the boring stuff. That's why you're suited for the kind of work you do." It was said casually, affectionately even, but the message was clear. This is where you belong. I felt something settle then. Not sadness, not anger, but recognition. The role I'd been playing wasn't temporary. It wasn't a phase I'd grow out of once I proved myself. It was permanent because it served them. Being invisible meant never competing. Being reliable meant never refusing. Being calm meant never challenging the narrative. And my mother, whether consciously or not, relied on this version of me to sustain her own identity, the self-sacrificing parent whose efforts could never be questioned. If I succeeded too visibly, it threatened that story. If I questioned the ledger, it weakened her authority. So the role had to be maintained. That realization was sobering, but also strangely liberating. Because once you see the role clearly, you can decide whether to continue performing it. I didn't change my behavior immediately. I didn't confront her. I didn't withdraw. Instead, I started to observe with intent. I noticed how often I was included only when something needed to be done. How rarely I was consulted on matters that affected me. How my opinions were acknowledged politely and then ignored. And I noticed something else. No one was actually looking at me. They saw the role, the function, the predictable response. They weren't watching for deviation. They weren't prepared for resistance because they couldn't imagine it coming from someone like me. That was when I understood the true nature of my position. I wasn't powerless. I was underestimated. And that, I would soon learn, is a very different thing. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no breaking point that forced clarity into the open. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it would have been easy to miss. I was alone in my apartment, sorting through mail that had piled up on the kitchen counter. Bills, bank statements, a few unopened envelopes I'd been avoiding without a clear reason. I'd just come back from visiting my mother the week before, still carrying the low-grade tension those visits always left behind. One envelope stood out, not because it looked official, but because it didn't. No return address, just my name, written in my mother's handwriting. Neat, deliberate. I sat down before opening it. That should have been my first clue. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not a letter in the traditional sense, no greeting, no signature, just a list. Tuition, housing, medical expenses, extracurriculars. Each item had a dollar amount next to it. Large ones. and at the bottom, a total. Tris simtipx dismit tuxtoshi dollaru. Beneath the number, a title in bold, the cost of raising a failure. I read it twice, then a third time, slower, waiting for the emotional reaction everyone expects in stories like this. It didn't come. What I felt instead was distance, a strange, almost clinical detachment, as if I were looking at an artifact rather than an accusation. This wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the ledger I'd always sensed was real. That her sacrifices were not expressions of care, but transactions she expected a return on. And that, in her eyes, I had defaulted. I noticed how carefully it had been formatted. The precision, the confidence. This wasn't a message sent in anger. It was prepared, calculated, intended to land. She thought it would humiliate me, that I would call, flustered, apologetic, scrambling to defend myself. She thought it would finally put me in my place. Instead, it clarified mine. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being unfair, whether I'd misunderstood her intentions, whether I owed her something I hadn't yet given. The answer was there, in black and white. I owed her silence, and I'd already paid enough. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Not out of respect, but because I understood its value had just changed. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. I didn't confront her. I didn't tell anyone. I went to work the next day as usual. I answered emails. I smiled when appropriate. But internally, the narrative that had governed my behavior for decades dissolved. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was no longer trying to be forgiven. And most importantly, I was no longer trying to prove my worth to someone who had already decided the outcome. That evening, I called my grandmother. We weren't particularly close, but there had always been a quiet understanding between us. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was with intention. I didn't tell her about the bill. Not yet. I simply asked how she was. We talked about small things, her garden, her health, the weather. Before we hung up, she paused and said, almost casually, "You know, Evelyn, sometimes people tell on themselves without realizing it." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to, because for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was orienting. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. I began to see my silence not as endurance, but as a choice, one that could be withdrawn. And once you understand that your compliance is optional, everything changes. Quietly, irreversibly. After the bill arrived, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth. Now it was deliberate, chosen, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. I didn't contact my mother. Not to argue, not to explain, not to ask what she meant. I knew exactly what she meant. Any response would have been a form of validation, an acknowledgement that her framing still had power over me. So I said nothing. At first, I told myself I was just buying time. But as days passed, I realized I wasn't waiting to respond. I was observing what happened in the absence of one. She reached out, indirectly. A text about something mundane, a forwarded article, an innocuous question that required no emotional engagement. I replied politely, briefly, as if nothing had changed. From her perspective, this must have been confusing. She was used to my predictability, my availability, my emotional accessibility. And now, without announcing anything, I had withdrawn something she'd come to rely on. Still, she didn't confront me about the bill. That told me something important. She wasn't interested in dialogue, she was interested in effect. And the effect she wanted, shame, panic, compliance, wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, I began to make small adjustments that looked like nothing from the outside. I stopped volunteering information about my life. I stopped anticipating her needs. I stopped cushioning my words to avoid hypothetical discomfort. I didn't become cold. I became neutral. Neutrality, I discovered, is deeply unsettling to people who are accustomed to emotional leverage. She began to talk more when we spoke. To explain herself unprompted. To remind me of things she'd done for me in the past, as if laying groundwork for a future argument that hadn't yet been scheduled. I listened, calmly. I let the monologues unfold. And I noticed how much she revealed when she assumed I was still the same compliant listener. She spoke about money often, about fairness, about how children these days don't understand sacrifice. She referenced numbers, time, opportunity cost. Each detail reinforced what the bill had already made explicit. She viewed motherhood as an investment portfolio and me as a poor-performing asset. The difference now was that I wasn't absorbing it emotionally. I was processing it analytically. At work, this wasn't new territory. I was trained to spot patterns, inconsistencies, and risk exposure, to separate narrative from data. And once I applied that lens to my own family dynamics, the fog lifted. Her authority had always depended on my engagement, on my need to be seen as good, as reasonable, as grateful. By choosing silence, not as avoidance but as a strategy, I was quietly dismantling that structure. Others mistook it for weakness. My sister asked if everything was okay between Mum and me. I said yes. My brother joked that I was always the peacemaker anyway. I smiled. They didn't see withdrawal, they saw stability. That invisibility worked in my favor because while no one was paying attention, I was paying close attention to myself. I felt when I stopped explaining how much lighter it felt to let misunderstanding exist without rushing to correct it. Silence had become a boundary. And boundaries, unlike arguments, don't require consensus to function. I began to understand something my grandmother had hinted at years earlier. The most effective shifts don't announce themselves. They reconfigure the terrain so gradually that by the time anyone notices, the old map no longer applies. My mother thought my silence meant compliance. In reality, it meant preparation. What they never noticed was how much space silence creates. When you stop filling every pause, stop defending every choice, stop smoothing over every discomfort, something interesting happens. Other people start talking more. They explain themselves. They repeat old stories, add new details, and contradict themselves without realizing it. And no one did this more freely than my mother, because she believed she already understood me. That assumption was my cover. While she continued narrating her version of the past, I began quietly reconstructing it. Not emotionally, methodically. I wasn't looking for vindication, I was looking for accuracy. It started with documents. At first, it was incidental. Old tax records she'd asked me to scan years ago, bank statements I'd helped organize temporarily that somehow never made their way back into storage. Insurance paperwork, education savings plans. I had never thought twice about having copies. It was practical, responsible, exactly the kind of thing my role allowed without suspicion. Now I revisited them with fresh eyes. The numbers didn't match the story. Tuition amounts were inflated. Certain expenses were counted twice, once as direct payments, again as opportunity cost. Grants and scholarships I'd earned were conspicuously absent from her ledger. Funds set aside by my grandmother were reframed as personal sacrifice. It wasn't sloppy, it was selective. I didn't jump to conclusions, I cross-checked. Dates, account transfers, notes in margins I'd ignored years earlier because they weren't my concern then. They were now. At the same time, I began documenting interactions. Not obsessively, just factually. Dates of conversations, statements made, shifts in tone. I wasn't building a case, I was building clarity. And clarity has a way of compounding. The more I looked, the more I realized how long this narrative had been under construction. How early I'd been positioned as the liability, the one whose existence justified her grievances. It explained so much. Why were my successes minimized? Why was my independence framed as ingratitude? Why did she need a number, $350,000, to make her resentment feel legitimate? This wasn't about money. It was about control. And money was just the language she used fluently. While she spoke in totals and sacrifices, I looked at the flow, sources, ownership, intent. One afternoon, I visited my grandmother. This time, I brought the envelope. I didn't dramatize it. I placed it on the table between us, the way one might place a document that simply needed reviewing. She read it slowly, carefully. Her expression didn't change much, but her silence did. It deepened. When she finished, she folded the paper once and set it aside. "That's thorough," she said finally. I waited. "You know," she continued, "your mother has always liked numbers. They make feelings feel official." I didn't respond. She looked at me for a long moment, then stood and went to another room. When she returned, she carried a folder, old, worn, heavy with history. Inside were documents I'd never seen. Trust records, account statements, notes in my grandmother's handwriting, evidence of financial support that predated many of the expenses my mother claimed as her own burden. Some funds had been designated specifically for my education. Others were meant to offset living costs. All of them had been quietly absorbed into the household narrative of sacrifice. My grandmother didn't sound angry as she explained. She sounded precise. "I assumed you knew," she said. "Or that it would come up naturally. I didn't think your mother would." She stopped herself. "I'm telling you now because I think you're ready to understand," she finished. That was the moment preparations stopped being solitary. I didn't feel vindicated, I felt sober. Because what I was seeing wasn't just misrepresentation, it was a long-standing pattern of appropriation. Of credit being claimed, roles being reinforced, and truth being shaped to serve a single identity. My grandmother didn't tell me what to do. She didn't suggest confrontation. She simply said, "You should have all the information that concerns you." And that was enough. What they never noticed was that while they were certain of who I was becoming very certain of what was real. They mistook my quiet for absence, but I was present. I was learning, I was positioning, and the groundwork they'd never imagined me capable of laying was already in place. There's a particular kind of clarity that doesn't arrive with excitement or relief. It arrives quietly, like a door closing behind you. You don't rush forward, you don't look back, you simply understand that something irreversible has occurred. That's what the private reveal felt like. After my visit with my grandmother, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even revisit the envelope for several days. I let the information settle, not emotionally, but structurally, like a new framework being installed over an old foundation. Because what I had uncovered wasn't just a discrepancy in numbers. It was leverage. Not the dramatic kind people fantasize about. Not a secret that explodes on impact. This was something far more potent. Proof that the story I'd been living under was incomplete, and that the authority enforcing it was built on selective truth. I began reviewing everything again, this time with my grandmother's documents included. I mapped timelines, tracked flows of money, compared what had been received, what had been claimed, and what had been omitted. The pattern was consistent. My mother hadn't fabricated expenses out of thin air. That would have been reckless. Instead, she reframed shared or externally supported costs as personal sacrifice. She inflated totals by including hypothetical alternatives, money she could have earned, opportunities she might have taken. It was narrative accounting. And the $350,000 figure? It wasn't a calculation. It was a statement. A way of saying, "You owe me more than you can ever repay." That realization shifted something fundamental. Because once you see that a debt is designed to be unpayable, you stop trying to settle it. You start questioning why it exists at all. I thought back to every moment I'd swallowed a correction, every time I'd stayed quiet to preserve peace, every instance where my success was softened so it wouldn't threaten her story. All of it had been in service of maintaining a balance that was never meant to be fair. And suddenly my silence had a new meaning. I wasn't withholding words, I was withholding legitimacy. That night, I drafted a document. Not a response, not a rebuttal. A record, a neutral summary of facts, sources, and discrepancies. No accusations, no commentary, just alignment between reality and representation. I didn't send it. Not yet, because the private reveal wasn't about action. It was about orientation. I needed to understand what I had before deciding how or whether to use it. Power, I'd learned, is not an exposure. It's an option. And I had options now. I could confront her and dismantle the narrative directly. I could involve third parties and let neutrality do the work. I could disengage entirely, leaving the ledger unanswered. Each option carried consequences, not just for her, but for the family ecosystem that had formed around her authority. That was the moment restraint mattered most. I wasn't interested in humiliation. I wasn't even interested in validation. What I wanted was alignment between how I lived and what I accepted as truth. And that meant choosing a path that didn't require anyone else's permission to be effective. The most unsettling part was how calm I felt. No adrenaline, no vindictive satisfaction, just a steady, grounded awareness that the story she thought she'd ended with that bill had only revealed its own weak points. She believed numbers would silence me. Instead, they had freed me. Because once you understand the mechanics of someone's control, you stop reacting to its surface expressions. You stop defending. You stop explaining. You stop playing your assigned role. And you begin preparing for the moment when your absence, emotional, logistical, narrative, will be felt. The private reveal wasn't something I shared. It was something I carried. and carrying it changed the way I moved through every interaction that followed. The decision didn't arrive as a single moment of certainty. It unfolded gradually, like a horizon coming into view. The closer I got, the clearer my direction became. For weeks after the private reveal, I lived with the possibility. I went to work. I met deadlines. I answered family messages. On the surface, nothing shifted, but internally, every interaction was now filtered through a different lens. I asked myself one question repeatedly. What outcome aligns with who I am becoming, not who I was trained to be? That question ruled out a lot. Confrontation, for example. It would have been tempting to present the documents, to dismantle her narrative piece by piece. But I knew how that story would end. Not with accountability, but with deflection. Tears, claims of misunderstanding, a reassertion of emotional authority. She wouldn't absorb the truth. She would weaponize the conflict. I also considered complete disengagement, walking away without explanation, letting the ledger sit unanswered. That would have protected my peace, but it would have left the narrative intact. She would still be the martyr. I would still be the failure who couldn't face her debt. That didn't sit right either. I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in ending a system. The system required my participation. My silence, yes, but also my availability, my labor, my emotional responsiveness. So the irreversible choice became clear. I would withdraw from the role entirely. Not dramatically, not punitively, structurally. I began with boundaries that couldn't be argued with because they weren't framed as reactions. They were framed as decisions. I declined requests that assumed my compliance, politely, without explanation. I stopped handling family logistics. I redirected responsibilities back to their origin. When my mother asked why I was pulling away, I didn't correct her phrasing. I simply said, I'm restructuring my priorities. It was the truth. I consulted a financial advisor, not to escalate but to clarify, to ensure my independence was complete, that no informal ties or obligations could be retroactively reframed as debt. I updated the documents, accounts, permissions, quiet moves that didn't announce themselves but changed the landscape. And I prepared one final piece, a letter, not to my mother, to myself. In it, I articulated what I would no longer accept. Not accusations, not grievances, just boundaries, written clearly, without emotion. I acknowledged the care I had received without converting it into debt. I recognized effort without accepting ownership over my life. I named my autonomy without hostility. That letter wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to anchor me, because once I moved forward, there would be moments of doubt, pressure to explain, invitations to revert. I needed something solid to return to. The decision point, I realized, isn't about choosing between options. It's about choosing which part of yourself you're willing to abandon. I was done abandoning myself. When I was ready, I sent a brief message to my mother. It didn't mention the bill. It didn't mention the documents. It didn't mention the past. It said only this. I'm taking some space to focus on my own life. I won't be available for a while. I hope you understand. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, she was confused, then irritated, then I'm concerned. I didn't engage, because the decision had already been made. And once you make an irreversible choice quietly, the consequences don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive slowly, and they don't ask permission. Once the decision was made, everything that followed felt almost anticlimactic. That surprised me. I had expected tension, anxiety, a sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Instead, there was a steady calm, like walking on solid ground after years of compensating for instability. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about precision. I didn't announce my boundaries. I didn't justify them. I simply lived inside them. I reduced contact to essentials. Short messages, neutral tone, no emotional labor. When questions came, "Are you okay? Why are you distant?" I answered with the same line, repeated calmly. I'm focusing on my own responsibilities right now. Repetition, I learned, is a boundary's best reinforcement. Behind the scenes, I made quiet adjustments that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. I removed myself from shared accounts. I updated emergency contacts. I ensured all personal documents were inaccessible without my consent. Not because I expected retaliation, but because clarity requires clean lines. At work, I requested a transfer to a different project team. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create breathing room. I began investing more intentionally, planning further ahead, the kind of moves you make when you're no longer orienting your life around someone else's expectations. My mother, meanwhile, grew restless. Without my presence to absorb her narratives, they had nowhere to land. She reached out to my siblings, to relatives. I heard about it secondhand. She's worried about you. She doesn't understand what she did wrong. She feels shut out. I let those messages pass through me without response. Because the point wasn't to be understood. It was to be unreachable by the old system. Silence did something unexpected. It shifted the burden of explanation back onto her. Without my engagement, she had to sit with her own version of events and defend it without my cooperation. That proved harder than she anticipated. She sent another message, longer this time, emotional, nostalgic, a reminder of everything we've been through. I read it once, then I archived it, not out of cruelty, out of commitment. This phase wasn't about punishment, it was about consistency. I didn't leak information. I didn't rally allies. I didn't seek validation. I trusted that structural changes would speak louder than emotional appeals ever could. And they did. Slowly, others began to notice the absence. Family logistics stalled, tasks went undone, conversations became repetitive. My name came up more often, not as an afterthought, but as a missing component. They were experiencing loss, not of me as a person, but of the function I had quietly provided. That distinction mattered, because it revealed something no confrontation ever could. They didn't miss my voice, they missed my utility. And that realization, painful as it was, confirmed the correctness of my choice. Moving in silence meant allowing that truth to surface without commentary. It meant resisting the urge to soften the consequences of my withdrawal. It meant trusting that clarity would emerge on its own timeline. I didn't know when the reckoning would arrive. I didn't even know what form it would take. But I knew this. The old narrative required my presence to survive. And I was no longer present. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They seeped in gradually, like water finding cracks in a foundation everyone assumed was solid. At first it was logistical. A bill was missed. A form was submitted late. A misunderstanding that would have once been quietly corrected without comment. My absence didn't cause chaos, but it introduced friction. And friction has a way of drawing attention. My mother began reaching out more frequently. The tone shifted from irritation to urgency, then to something resembling confusion. She asked questions she already knew the answers to, or should have. Do you know where we keep? Can you remind me when? Didn't you handle this before? Each time I responded the same way. I'm not available to manage that. No explanation, no apology. The words felt foreign at first, then they felt accurate. Others noticed too. My sister called, her voice cautious. She asked if something was wrong with Mum. I said, I didn't know. I meant it. Whatever was happening now was unfolding without my participation. That unsettled her. When you've always been the stabilizing force, your neutrality feels like abandonment to those who relied on it. But neutrality isn't cruelty, it's clarity. My brother, more direct, asked why I was making things difficult. I didn't correct the framing. I'm not, I said. I'm just not managing them anymore. The distinction landed harder than I expected, because difficulty had always been something I absorbed. Now, it had nowhere to go. My mother began narrating her distress more publicly, to relatives, to friends. She framed my distance as confusion, then as ingratitude, then as emotional coldness. The story shifted depending on the audience, but without my cooperation, it lacked coherence. People started asking questions, not of me, but of her. Small ones at first, innocent sounding. She always handled that, didn't she? Didn't Evelyn help with those things? Why wouldn't she be involved? Those questions didn't accuse, they exposed. And slowly, the narrative she'd maintained so confidently began to strain under its own contradictions. She reached out again, this time directly addressing the bill. I didn't mean it the way it came across, she wrote. It was just a way of expressing how much I gave. You know I sacrificed everything for you. I read the message carefully. There it was, the attempt to reframe, to turn impact into intention, to make my reaction to the problem rather than the act itself. I didn't respond, because the consequence she was now experiencing wasn't my anger. It was my absence. And absence, unlike confrontation, offers no foothold. She couldn't argue with me. She couldn't defend herself to me. She couldn't extract reassurance or forgiveness. All she could do was feel the structural shift. The family dynamic she had relied on was changing, and she didn't control the narrative anymore. That loss of control manifested in subtle ways. Passive comments, over-explaining, sudden generosity that felt more like panic than care. I observed it all without comment. Not because I lacked compassion, but because I understood something crucial. If I stepped back in now, even to clarify, the system would reassemble around me. The consequences had to be felt fully to be real, and they were. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. She was learning in real time what it meant to treat someone as expendable, only to discover they were structural. And for the first time, I wasn't cushioning the realization. By the time my mother realized something was truly wrong, she had already missed the window to fix it. That window hadn't closed because of anger or spite. It had closed because the conditions that allowed repair, mutual respect, honesty, restraint, had never been present to begin with. At first, she tried urgency. Her messages became more frequent, more insistent. She asked to meet, to talk things through. She suggested misunderstandings, timing issues, and stress. Anything that framed the rupture as circumstantial rather than structural. I declined each request calmly. Now isn't a good time. I don't think a conversation would be productive. Those sentences weren't weapons. They were boundaries. When urgency failed, she tried vulnerability. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling unappreciated, of how hard it was to be a mother without acknowledgement. She hinted at health issues, at exhaustion, at regret, but never at responsibility. The pattern was familiar. Emotion offered not as reflection, but as leverage. And for the first time, it didn't work. Because vulnerability that refuses accountability is just another strategy. She began involving others more overtly, asking relatives to intervene, to remind me of family obligations, to suggest reconciliation before things went too far. They reached out to me, cautiously, each in their own way. I listened. I thanked them for their concern, and I said the same thing every time. I'm not in conflict, I'm just no longer participating. That answer frustrated them. Conflict invites mediation. Non-participation leaves nothing to negotiate. They didn't know how to fix something that wasn't broken, just withdrawn. My grandmother quietly stopped deflecting. When my mother complained to her, she didn't take sides. She asked questions. Practical ones. What did you say? What did you expect would happen? Questions my mother wasn't prepared to answer, because the truth was, she had believed the bill would force a reaction, that it would reassert authority, that it would remind me of my place. She hadn't considered the possibility that it would end the conversation entirely. By the time she understood that, the dynamic had already shifted. I had built a life that no longer required her approval or her involvement. My routines, finances, and emotional stability were self-contained. There was nothing to threaten, nothing to withhold, and that made reversal impossible. She asked finally what she could do to make things right. I paused before responding, because this was the first time she'd asked a question that didn't assume an answer. I replied simply, I don't want anything from you. The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have, because it removed her from the equation entirely. There was nothing to negotiate, no debt to repay, no role to resume. And once someone understands they are no longer needed to define you, the power dynamic dissolves. She didn't respond after that. Not immediately. When she did, weeks later, it was restrained, polite, distant. The bill was never mentioned again. Neither was the ledger. It faded. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer had an audience. That was when I understood something important. Repair requires access. Control requires engagement. But freedom requires neither. It requires only the willingness to let something remain unfinished. And I was willing. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its simplicity. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no emotional outpouring. Just two people sitting across from each other, no longer operating under the same assumptions. It took place months later, at my grandmother's house. Neutral ground. She had invited us both under the pretense of a family lunch. I considered declining, but something told me this moment was inevitable, and that avoiding it would give it more weight than it deserved. When I arrived, my mother was already there. She looked older than I remembered. Not fragile, just less certain. The kind of uncertainty that shows when authority has gone unreinforced for too long. We exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. For a while we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, my grandmother's garden, safe topics that required no positioning. Eventually, my grandmother excused herself, leaving us alone at the table. That was when my mother spoke. "I don't understand why you shut me out," she said. Her tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, careful, as if she were stepping onto thin ice. I took a moment before responding, not to compose myself, but to ensure accuracy. "I didn't shut you out," I said. "I stepped back." She frowned slightly. "That feels the same." "It isn't," I replied. "One is an act against someone. The other is an act for myself." She absorbed that quietly. Then she said, "That letter about the money, I shouldn't have sent it. Not I was wrong, not I hurt you. I shouldn't have sent it." I nodded. "You're right," I said. She waited, clearly expecting more. A release, a reassurance, a bridge. It didn't come. "I thought you understood what I meant," she continued. "I just wanted you to see everything I gave up." "I did see it," I said. "What I saw was a transaction I never agreed to. That was the closest I came to confrontation. No raised voice, no accusation, just a statement of fact." She shifted in her seat. "Parents make sacrifices, that's normal." "Sacrifice isn't the issue," I replied. "Ownership is." Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind, the clarifying kind. I could see her recalibrating, searching for the familiar levers: guilt, obligation, history. They weren't there anymore. "I don't want us to be strangers," she said finally. "We aren't," I answered. "We're just not enmeshed." That word seemed to catch her off guard. I didn't explain it, because explanation invites negotiation. And this wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't asking her to change. I wasn't asking for an apology. I wasn't asking for understanding. I was informing her of a boundary that already existed. We sat there a little longer, spoke about neutral things again. Then my grandmother returned, and the conversation shifted. When I left, there was no resolution in the traditional sense. But there was something better. There was no longer any heat. The confrontation hadn't been about exposing her. It hadn't been about vindicating me. It had been about making the truth unmovable. And once truth stops moving, so do the arguments built around it. I drove home that afternoon feeling lighter. Not because something had been fixed, but because nothing was left hanging. The past remained the past, and I had finally stopped carrying it forward. The most unexpected part of everything that followed was how little anger I carried with me. I had imagined, once, long ago, that if I ever truly broke free, it would come with bitterness, with a need to justify myself, with a long internal monologue cataloguing everything I'd endured. That didn't happen. What replaced it was something quieter and far more stable: self-definition. I no longer introduce myself in ways that preempt misunderstanding. I don't soften my accomplishments or explain my choices before anyone asks. I don't perform calmly to make others comfortable. I am calm now because my life is aligned. The space I created by withdrawing from old dynamics didn't stay empty. It filled naturally, with clarity, with time, with relationships that didn't require me to disappear in order to function. I still speak to my mother occasionally. Our conversations are polite, measured, limited. She no longer frames herself as my benefactor. I no longer frame myself as her project. We coexist. That, I've learned, is sometimes the most honest outcome available. My grandmother and I grew closer, not through shared resentment, but through shared restraint. She never said, "I told you so." She never pushed me toward confrontation. She respected the way I chose to carry the truth. And in doing so, she modeled something I hadn't seen before: power that doesn't need to announce itself. Professionally, I've continued to grow, not in leaps, but in direction. I choose projects that challenge me. I say no without guilt. I no longer confuse usefulness with worth. And perhaps most importantly, I trust my own perception now. That trust is what I lacked for years. I had been trained to doubt my reactions, to question whether discomfort was justified, to believe that clarity required consensus. It doesn't. Clarity requires honesty with yourself first. I don't regret staying quiet for as long as I did. Silence kept me safe when I didn't yet have the tools to act. It gave me time to observe, to learn, to prepare. But I no longer mistake silence for virtue. Now, when I choose it, it's intentional. And when I speak, it's precise. The story my mother told about me, that I was a failure, a poor return on investment, no longer has a place to land. Not because I disproved it loudly, but because I stopped hosting it internally. There's a particular freedom in realizing that not every injustice requires exposure. Some require distance, some require patience, and some dissolve the moment you stop participating in them. Who I am now isn't defined by opposition to the past. It's defined by autonomy, by the ability to say, without drama or explanation, this is where I end and you begin, and to live comfortably in that distinction. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain and a victor, to decide who was right, who was wrong, who won. But life rarely offers conclusions that clean. What I learned through all of this is something quieter and more enduring. Some people don't hurt you because they're cruel. They hurt you because they've built their identity on being owed. And when that happens, your existence becomes a ledger instead of a relationship. For a long time, I believed endurance was the same thing as strength. That if I stayed calm enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, things would eventually balance out. That if I could just prove my worth clearly enough, the story would change. It didn't, because the story was never about evidence. It was about control. The bill my mother sent wasn't a mistake. It was a reveal, a moment where her internal accounting slipped into the open, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice in the way we usually imagine it. It was a withdrawal. I stopped trying to be understood by someone who needed me, misunderstood, to remain comfortable. I stopped explaining my humanity to someone who preferred it itemized. I stopped carrying a debt that was designed to keep me small. And in doing so, something important happened. The narrative lost its audience. Quiet dominance doesn't look like triumph. It looks like alignment, like choosing yourself without asking permission, like letting other people sit with the consequences of the roles they assigned. There was no moment where my mother apologized in a way that changed everything. There was no public reckoning, no applause. There was just a calm, irreversible shift. And that was enough. If there's a moral here, it's not that you should cut people off, or confront them, or document every slight. It's this. If someone insists on measuring your worth in a currency you never agreed to use, you are allowed to stop participating in the transaction. You don't owe explanations to people who profit from misunderstanding you. You don't owe access to people who treat care as leverage. And you don't owe your future to anyone who keeps you trapped in the past. Sometimes the most powerful response is not to correct the story, but to leave it behind entirely. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever been quietly carrying a role or a debt that was never yours to begin with? If so, you're not alone, and you don't have to resolve it loudly for it to be real. Thank you for listening.